These problems are too profound and too fundamental to be swept aside. They cannot be kicked down the road. They will continue emerging and undermining and destabilizing the Israeli political order and Israeli society until they're fixed. And it's not going anywhere. Doesn't matter if there's no political will. Doesn't matter if it doesn't matter who's winning elections. It doesn't even matter what security challenges and risks and dangers Israel has. These issues go to the core of Israeli society and government, and they will continue to plague us until they're resolved.
Welcome to the Mailtime Podcast. I am joined today by Yonatan Green, author of the new book, Rogue Justice. Came out in October. He's an Israeli attorney and a fellow at the Georgetown University Center for the Constitution.
That's right.
Yonatan, I got it right. Yonatan, thanks for joining.
Great to be here.
Since I've started this podcast, I've noticed that there are a number of Americans and Israelis who depend on some of the mainstream news coverage to understand issues. Some even depend on their rabbis when they go to synagogue on the Jewish Sabbath. Some depend on their pastors if they go to church, and they're listening or reading the Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, other places. And certainly with the judicial reform and everything that was going on before October 7th and thereafter, now Benjamin Netanyahu still has trial. I want to start at the basics so people can try to get an understanding. The intention of this podcast is for people to actually understand some of the legal system in Israel and what was going on before October 7th so that they can actually get it. This is not to give a free pass to any players or to say that Benjamin Netanyahu is a good prime minister or a bad prime minister. It's not really a political issue. I want people to understand the judicial system beyond what you would read in Times of Israel, Haaretz, Jerusalem Post. So to the best of your ability, could we start here, please, with what is the general framework of the Israeli legal system and where has it gone off the rails a bit in your estimation?
Absolutely. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for having me on over here. I think before I even answer your question, I think you made such a good point about the surface level coverage of these issues. And this is one of the first points that I make at the beginning of my book. I don't think people appreciate quite how isolated Israel is. And when we talk about isolation, people usually think about, diplomatic isolation and boycott and that kind of thing. But that's not what I'm talking about. Israel culturally is deeply isolated from other Western democratic countries. And the ability of Israelis to understand what's going on elsewhere, but especially for non-Israelis to understand what's going on inside Israel is extremely difficult. If you don't speak fluent Hebrew, and if you're not constantly engaged with these issues, and if you don't have reliable resources to engage with these issues, then you will be receiving a very specific, a very curated, a very, I'll say biased, but that's not even the right word, a very particular view of everything that happens in Israel. And I think there are very few places where this is so true, or where this is as true as regarding the legal system in Israel's system of government. And one of the biggest things that I've seen, especially with the controversies before October 7th, right, and over 2023 and with the legal reform and quite before that, and this is kind of a project that I've embarked on even before that, is that unlike other issues in Israel, unlike the Arab-Israeli conflict and unlike some other issues, the legal controversies in Israel are an issue which non-Israelis simply have no clue about. They don't even have anywhere to start. The resources available are so slim and minimal, and of course, the information that does get out from Israel in English to a non-Israeli audience is so selective and I think misleading for a variety of reasons. So I just wanted to agree with you on how important it is to understand that point, how important it is to understand how limited information is, and whatever information you're getting is likely serving a particular agenda, or at the very least, it's reflecting a very specific perspective on these issues.
And also just want to, and I'll just add right here, is that when we use certain words in America, and this is where the the English-Hebrew divide is very important for people to understand. There are certain words that are used in English which appeal to an American audience or a foreign audience that have vastly different meanings in Israel. And NGOs, which may or may not be receiving money from foreign entities that promote this narrative, are well aware of that. So when they're talking about democracy is under attack in Israel, they are appealing to a certain type of person who is concerned about, say, Donald Trump, or something along those lines in America when you're talking about constitutional limits and constitutional power and the uh, separation of powers in the United States, which is extremely different in Israel. 99% of people have absolutely no idea about that.
Absolutely true. The differences between the systems, both Israel and the United States and Israel and other places, are profound. The differences in terminology are very significant, and people absolutely do not recognize those differences when casually discussing these issues. And of course, look, we're going to have this conversation, and I hope we're going to do a deep dive, and people will listen and get their own impression. But part of the reason I wrote the book is because I think the details matter. They matter a lot, and a serious, in-depth discussion of these issues really matters. And you as a viewer, you as a listener, you as an informed, right, individual engaging with these issues, you cannot pretend to have an informed and educated view unless you do the work and do that deep dive. And I hope this book offers at least part of the solution to that problem, or at least answers or provides some of that needs. Finally, to answer your question, you asked, about the Israeli legal system, or some of the structural points of the Israeli legal system. I guess the short version is that the Israeli legal system started out in many ways as a mess. And this is one of the first things that I say in my introduction to the book. I have a subsection which I call "All Founders, No Framers." And what I mean by that is Israel had this extraordinary group of people who founded the state, people of incredible capabilities, incredible intellect, and really, giants of Israeli history and culture, of Western history and culture. And yet, what they weren't good at and what they didn't know much about was statecraft and state building and, constitutional government and all these things which are required in order to build a state. And even if they did have these skills, which I think most would agree they didn't, but even if they did, it's agreed that they simply did not have the time, the bandwidth, the opportunity to put together some kind of stellar, right, a fantastic system. So I say that, and again, in the book, I say, it was a new state, but it was not state of the art. So many of the arrangements, legal, governmental arrangements that Israel started off with were essentially inherited from its previous iterations, inherited from the British colonialist mandate, inherited from the Ottoman Empire. These themselves sort of incorporated all kinds of elements of Sharia law and Islamic law. They incorporated what's called civil law, European continental law, which is very different from common law and English-based law. And of course, through the British and through other ways, they also incorporated a great deal of common law and English law. So all this is to say, and I know this doesn't necessarily mean much to our listener, but all this is to say that Israel started off to begin with as a very big mess. And it didn't have the advantage of, some messes are good. Some messes sort of grow over time and organically they develop, they evolve into systems which are highly effective, even though nobody really thought about it and put it together. So Israel didn't have that. We haven't been around for hundreds of years where we've been able to hone our government systems. And on the other hand, Israel had nothing like the US Constitution or other countries where a bunch of really smart people get together and think very deeply about how they want their government to be arranged, how they want their laws to be
Israel
arranged.
still doesn't have a constitution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, so that's a good point, and let's jump right into that. So Israel was founded in 1948, clearly wanted to put together a constitution. The Israeli Declaration of Independence envisions a constitution. There's this, and they clearly state that some state organs will be subject to a constitution that will be enacted and so and so. But that never ends up happening. And I go quite a lot into the book about why that ended up happening. I'm not sure it was entirely a bad thing. I think it was in many senses, a wise and prudent decision on the part of early Israeli leaders. Setting that aside
Why? Well,
for a
actually,
moment, yeah,
one second. I know you want to say
yeah, sure,
for the loyal listeners of the Mail Time podcast. I want to go into these issues. There's so many little bits that you just offered there that I certainly I'm more interested in as well. But I actually think that if we're going to take the time and properly go through some of your points here, I think it is important for people to understand as a matter of history. Why do you say it's a good thing that they didn't
absolutely. Okay, so let's
actually
dive into
establish
that.
the Constitution?
I would love to dive into that. So let's open up this chapter. Okay, we're talking about 1948, 1949, 1950, the founding of the State of Israel, the earliest years of the State of Israel. Let's talk about the process of Israeli sort of so-called constitutionalism and how it came to be that Israel didn't end up having a constitution. Before we get into the why of it, let me just describe kind of quickly what happened in practice, and then we can get to the sort of reasons or thinking behind the decisions. Israelis elected in the first elections they went to in Israeli state, they elected what's called a constitutional assembly. And this constitutional assembly or constituent assembly, whatever we'll call it, had the mandate to draft and enact a constitution. Okay, and this was what they were elected for. However, on the first day, and the only plenary sitting that this constitutional assembly ever had, it immediately, essentially, abrogated its duty to enact a constitution and announced itself to be the first Israeli Knesset, the first Israeli parliament. Remember, imagine this: Israelis go to the polls. This is the first generation of Israelis, 1948. Israeli, or it might have been 1949. Israelis go to the polls, elect something called a constitutional assembly. That constitutional assembly is supposed to enact a constitution on its first day of existence, like the mayfly, right? It exists for one day. The Israeli Constitutional Assembly announces that it is now the Israeli Knesset, the first Israeli parliament. And in theory, this parliament starts doing all the stuff that the parliament of an early country does, meaning it starts enacting laws, it starts figuring things out, it appoints a government, et cetera, et cetera. What it doesn't do is enact a constitution. So stage two of this, again, this is really running through the cliff notes, and I go into great detail about this in the book. Stage two is they come up with a compromise in 1950, and that compromise is called the Harari Resolution. That's just named after a random Knesset member, a Harari, who steps up and tables this resolution. And he says, guys, basically, we're not managing to put together a constitution. This clearly isn't happening. Let's put that effort aside for now. Let's put a whole, how do you say it? Put a plug in that, right? Put a pin in it. Let's put a pin in it for a moment, and we'll do something else. We'll enact something called basic laws. We'll enact laws which are potential draft chapters of a future constitution. And what he essentially says, and again, I go into great detail about this in the book, he says, let's enact just the regular laws which govern our country. They're ordinary laws. They're not constitutional. They're not a constitution. But let's give them a little label. We'll call them basic laws, where we all understand that these have the potential to one day be amalgamated or incorporated together into being this future constitution. And that's what essentially they do. So that's what happens.
But how is that a good idea?
Okay. Now, what happened in 1950...
I'm saying, it's very, if you look at the founding of the United States, I think it's important the Constitution is set. It's very hard once the train has left the station to say, hey, guys, let's come back, especially knowing the different factions and the level of hatred between different camps, even within the Zionist movement. Who thought that this... I guess Harari thought it was a good idea, but why is that a good idea?
That's such a good question. And I'm even going to start out by saying I'm a constitutionalist. And I believe, I'm generally favorable towards constitutions. I think constitutions are probably the best model, right? The democracy is that's available to democracies in terms of establishing the system of government and setting, basic rules of separation of powers, et cetera, and of course protecting individual rights and minority rights, et cetera. The Harari Resolution was almost certainly not a good idea, and I get into that in the book. Why that's in many ways a terrible idea. It depends how you look at it. If you say, it depends how you interpret the Harari Resolution. I mean, we don't have to get into that now. But it almost certainly was not a good idea in terms of the way they did it. However, the point that I do make in the book is that while constitutionalism and having a constitution is generally a good idea, that doesn't mean that it necessarily fits all systems, all circumstances, and all contexts. And what I try and explain in the book, and I think many people don't realize this, is that in 1948, a constitution, or in fact, the effort to put together a constitution, the effort to make a constitution, was almost certainly detrimental and could have been ruinous for the early state of Israel. And what people don't recognize is that in 1948, and to some extent even today, the vast differences and controversies and disputes between different groups in Israel were profound. They were extreme. They were to a degree and scope and depth that is virtually unparalleled in typical founding moments of other democracies. And this is for a variety of reasons. I go over them in the book. Part of it is that you simply don't have a population, right, a steady population that's been there for hundreds of years. You don't have the kind of homogeneity, right? You don't have the kind of kinship where people generally resemble each other and believe in similar things and look like each other and come from similar backgrounds. you had this diversity of different groups and subsections of society, which almost never happens at founding moments of democracies for, again, for a variety of reasons. And so what happens is a country like that, one might argue that a country like that needs not the rigidity of a constitution, but the flexibility to be able to create their arrangements as they go along. They need the flexibility so they can bend and not break of what we call parliamentary supremacy, of a system in which it's an ordinary democracy, much like in the UK, much like in New Zealand, much like in other countries. Many countries in 1948 didn't have a constitution, right? This is beside the point, but this was not so unusual in 1948 to have a country without a constitution. So it wasn't so sort of unthinkable or crazy, at least back then. But going the model of parliamentary supremacy in which the electorate and majority can figure things out by themselves, where they have the agility to change bad arrangements, where they have that that ability to make compromises and for those compromises to change and shift all the time. The fact is, and I'll end on this note because it's a very long answer and we can keep talking about it. The fact is that constitutions don't create consensus, they require consensus. And yes, they can engender consensus. Yes, they can be an instrument for furthering consensus, but they require an underlying agreement of a huge majority about some very basic values, about some very basic ideas of government, about some very basic visions of the state, etc. And if that consensus doesn't exist, and it almost certainly did not exist in 1948 in Israel, certainly regarding the system of government and right, the method of government. If that foundation doesn't exist, then a constitution and even the attempt to put together a constitution could be ruinous. Some were worried that it would lead to the Balkanization of the Zionist project in Israel. I mean, think about the Altalena incident, right? Think about where we were on the brink of civil
Well,
war at many
one
moments.
sec, one sec. There's a
Yeah,
lot of people who know a
right.
lot about that, but please just provide a 30-second overview so that those who kind of, I don't want to say them October 7th participants, but people that are more interested post October 7th and might not know what the Altalena was.
Sure. So, I mean, very briefly, Altalena was kind of the tip of the iceberg or a reflection of a broader national mood. But the Altalena was an incident where one of Israel's militias, the Jews fighting in 1948 for Israel's independence, were built of various different militias with different ideological convictions and inclinations, etc. And Altalena was an arms shipment to one of these militias, even though the nascent Israeli government had already declared that it was creating one military and it was, outlawing all other militias, etc. So the Altalena ship is coming into dock on the right on the beach in Israel to the port in Israel. And the specific history is disputed, sort of who shot first and who gave the order. But ultimately, an actual firefight broke out between the official sort of state military forces and this ship coming in. The ship was ultimately sunk. Many Jews, brave, patriotic Jewish militia members were killed. Many say
Menachem Begin was on board and
and,
Yitzhak Rabin was on the beach.
exactly. And so you have this great historical moment in which, among other things, right, Menachem Begin, who was the leader of this militia, essentially said, down. And this is a historic decision by Menachem Begin, said, I'm not going to tear apart the state of Israel for this. We're going to go, we're not gonna maintain this militia anymore, and the militias were dispersed and disbanded and dispersed throughout the military. And this is just one small example, right, of how many fractures there were throughout Israeli society, how different the various segments of society were. Menachem Begin is a great example. David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli prime minister, refused to address Menachem Begin by name. I don't know if you're familiar by this. If you
there's times where he was in the Knesset and he would look to someone else and say the Knesset member to your left or your right.
I'll say the Knesset member to the left of member Bader, I think it was. So I mean, the level of, and now, yes, fine. Alexander Hamilton got killed in a duel right around the founding of the state. So there was obviously animosity, but it was, if we just take this one example, right, in the U.S. founding, 90% of Americans were British descent, or at least, British Isles descent, were Protestant Christians, spoke the same language.
Deists.
Well, no, that's the founders. But if we're talking about just the regular people who are voting,
no, but right, I'm only just not giving it to the America First lunatics.
Oh yeah, okay. I'm putting that aside. Yeah, I'm putting aside the deist, non-deist, right? discussion. But in terms of the electorate, what people were, and most of them had been living there for at least a few generations. So that's a very high level of homogeneity, which simply did not exist in Israel at the time. So to wrap this all up, there's an Israeli constitutional scholar called Dr. Shuki Segev, and he calls this the decision not to decide. And this was a conscious decision. And the point here, which really I think needs to be understood, is this was not a fluke. It was not an oversight. It wasn't negligence. These were Israelis coming together and taking a hard, sort of mature look at the situation and saying, we need to defer these fundamental decisions to a later time because the consensus to make these decisions doesn't exist right now. The consensus to make a constitution doesn't exist right now. And the very effort of putting together a constitution could be highly detrimental to the Zionist and destabilizing to the Zionist
I want to
project
push
itself.
back. I want to push back on one thing here. You said it's a mature decision. Question. My thought on hearing your description here and reading a lot of your book. They might have deferred for very good reasons, but saying that we are not going to take a clear and defined stance of what the state of Israel will be, I'm not sure that that's necessarily mature, again, in the English way of how we would define it, right? To say that we will stand for nothing other than this vague idea of whatever word you decide that fits your agenda, that's how you end up having these leftist brainwashing schools now in America, in the Jewish communities in America, saying, "Do you believe Israel should be a Jewish state, or Israel should be like a democracy first, or a
Right.
Jewish state first?"
Absolutely.
And the fact that they didn't take a stand on that issue is part of the problem. I don't know that's necessarily mature. I think, and again, hindsight's 2020, and you can have a discussion about it. But if the founders of the state, and you're talking, there's no framers, but if the first attempt at creating a constitution or having boundaries, if they did make it more defined, yes, it might have been to the exclusion of the beliefs of other people, but that's okay. I think you're kind of tugging on a string, which is they're worried about having enough people that actually live in the state of Israel. They're worried about bringing together people that are anti-religion and profoundly, devotedly religious. And part of this tension, which has erupted now in the Instagram, TikTok, Facebook Reel way of doing things, is as a result of their inability to actually just put their foot down. And that's how so many of these conversations now are so grossly misleading. And people, I certainly would say outside, people even in Hebrew don't necessarily understand what's going on, let alone those who are getting a translation of the situation. That coupled with the fact that Israel being attacked from so many sides and being, I would say, overly dependent on foreign involvement and aid from the United States, it's creating this very weird mix in which what you defined as maturity, and I'm not picking on that word, but I can't see it as a mature decision. I just see it as kind of kicking the can down the road for that very near-term victory, but the consequence of what that does and what it has done, we've only seen the tip of the iceberg, I'm afraid.
Look, I think that you make a very good point in a few senses, but one is that there's no question that not adopting a constitution, 1948 or 1950, was a massive misfortune. And it has incredibly damaging implications. It always has, and today they're in many senses getting worse. And actually, one of the recommendations that I make in the
Wait a second.
conclusion-
Wait a second. But not to interject, but I have to say, part of it not taking a stand on this issue from how you're describing it is actually eroding what I would call like basic facts. And because you can't agree on what the state of Israel is, how it's governed at its founding, therefore you can't even agree on basic facts of what is the state of Israel amongst these different camps. And therefore they go out on their different ways and they all have a different idea of what it is.
So let me respond to that, both in terms of the vision, articulating the vision of what Israel is and defining Israel. So I do want to respond to that. But I'll just say that, first of all, in the conclusion of my book, one of the first things that I suggest, one of the only and biggest real suggestion that I give or recommendation or whatever, and my conclusion is to have a constitutional assembly. And unlike a lot of other suggestions, it's not, here's a constitution that you should adopt, or here's take a bunch of professors and write a constitution. No, we need to go back to basics. We need to do what we neglected to do 1948. So I couldn't agree more that is something that is required, and we've been paying a price for not doing that. Now, was that a viable or feasible option at all in 1948? I think that's a point of debate. And I think the argument that I'm making is not that necessarily it was the good or the perfect decision. I think they had a lot of bad options. I don't, putting aside for a moment the word mature, that's not necessarily what I meant. I call it a considered decision. It was a conscious decision. Maybe it was a bad one, but I think the point that I was making is to go back against some people that like to view this as an accident, as an oversight, as something of a mistake, and it wasn't. And it
No,
wasn't.
it was intentional. Okay.
And it wasn't just laziness or intentional in that sense. It was intentional in the sense that it identified genuine severe risks of trying to put together the Constitution, and it made a decision about the trade-offs. Maybe that was the wrong decision.
Who thinks that this bad news gets better with time? That's what I'm saying.
Fair enough. So then the other thing I'll say is that during the conversations about, at that time, one of the biggest opponents of a constitution was David Ben-Gurion. And he has a series of wonderful speeches where he talks about this issue. And one of them you can find online in English on Mosaic. On the Mosaic site, you can find, Ben-Gurion's speech to the Knesset or to the Constitution Committee on this issue. One of the points of many that he makes, again, I go into this in the book. One of the points that he makes is that if you want an articulation of the vision of the state, right? If you want a credo of the state, well, we already have that, says David Ben-Gurion. He says, we have the Declaration of Independence. We have this lasting description of what Israel is, what it's for, what it does. Now, maybe that's wrong. Maybe the Declaration of Independence doesn't appropriately or correctly capture the Israeli spirit. But at least that was the view of many at that time, that if we're talking about defining what Israel is and what it's for, then we've already done that with the Declaration of Independence. And if we're talking about putting together the system of government, that's something that we're trying to avoid because it's too dangerous, too risky, or too problematic. Then the last thing I'll say about this, which I really want to clarify, this is really important for our listeners. The fact that Israel did not adopt a constitution in 1948 doesn't mean that there was a vacuum and that Israel entered a state of sort of nothingness, in the sense that Israel entered the default mode of all democracy in the absence of a constitution. It's called parliamentary democracy, parliamentary supremacy. It's the system of government in the United Kingdom. It's the system of government in New Zealand. And it was a system of government for many countries in the world. And I'm saying that just to say, I don't want it to sound like the decision not to have a constitution meant we were all of a sudden in the Wild West. Israel had, in 1948 and 1950, a very clear understanding of what it was doing, of where it was heading, even and especially regarding the system of government, right? How elections work, who appoints the government, the executive government, how the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, operates. All these things were clear, they were defined, and they were gradually also enacted in clear legislation.
Okay, so where did things go off the rails?
So it's hard to pinpoint. Well, some things are easy to pinpoint, but I'm glad you're asking that question because I wrote a whole book about it. The biggest point, or the biggest, I mean, and this is not, my argument, the biggest watershed moment or cutoff moment where we see things starting to spiral out of control is in the 1980s onwards. Early 1980s, the Israeli Supreme Court starts moving towards an entirely different conception of what it does and what it can do. And this relates, and I'll go into detail in a moment, this relates to our earlier conversation because you're absolutely right that this is one of the many prices that Israel paid for not having a defined constitution with defined separation of powers and the different branches of government and their powers and authorities, etc. So the Supreme Court, and I say the Supreme Court, there are very specific people involved, from the 1980s onwards, the Supreme Court started exploiting these cracks in the system. They started exploiting its relative very high degree of power within the Israeli governmental order, and it started exploiting the relative weaknesses of the other Israeli branches of government in terms of their instability, in terms of other issues which are related to the Israeli government governing order. So what happens? Late 1970s, which is kind of the end of the classical court, 1979, a guy called Aharon Barak, which you might have heard of, is appointed to the Supreme Court, and he becomes justice of the Supreme Court. He goes on to serve at the Supreme Court, I think 30-something years. I'm trying to think, 79 to 2006, so almost 30 years, and I think 11 or 12 of them as Chief Justice. Justice Aharon Barak, who was a brilliant and charismatic jurist and a rising star in academia, and he briefly served as legal counsel to the government. Aharon Barak then goes on a mission to methodically and systematically reshape the Supreme Court's role in Israeli government, and by extension, he reshapes all of Israeli government itself and the entire governmental order. itself. Now we can start going into exactly how that happened. I want to come up for air for a second to see if you want to stop me there.
Well, I think correct me if I'm wrong, but it's important to note that this is shortly after the first time that Likud actually won elections, and it's the first time in Israel's history that there's a right-wing, right-of-center government. I'm assuming that has something to do with why he is now springing into action to try to, in his mind, I guess, left the ship instead of right the ship.
Certainly, I think that, one of the biggest writers on these issues is called Menachem Mautner, Meni Mautner. Meni Mautner was dean of the Tel Aviv Law School. He's on the deep left or on the far left. I think he described himself that way, meaning I don't think he'd take issue with that description. However, he's been one of the most consistent critics of the court and of the Supreme Court's expansion of its own power, and he's unusual in that sense that he belongs to sort of both those camps. So Mautner has, since the 80s, he's been in the 90s, he's had an entire theory about this where he explains how, after the political right gained political power in 1977, the left government that was in power at the time, and then the left sort of establishment, whether in or out of government, removed or transferred major portions of governing power to different unelected institutions or different unelected parts of Israeli government and society. So he gives three big examples. One is the budget committee in the treasury, and I won't go into this, but this is a sort of bureaucratic group which has enormous influence on the Israeli budgetary and Israeli economy. Another is the Israeli higher education, where they create all kinds of institutions which sort of insulate Israeli higher education and academia from Israeli elected government. And, if you can imagine what's happening in the U.S. with higher education, with academia, then just imagine that in Israel, it's on steroids and even worse by orders of magnitude. And that's in part related to what, according to Meni Mautner, what the left-wing governments did at the time in order to hamper and obstruct the ability of the new incoming right-wing government's power and ability to govern. But
I just want to wait a sec. Footnote right here. Just for those mail time, we talk a lot about the Israeli army, the IDF, and when you talk about budget, just people should note that the way in which purchasing works within the IDF and how it relates to the government has to do also with that budgetary committee. When you're talking about essential purchases, these people who have nothing to do with the military could actually interfere with what they're allowed to purchase, which is, most people don't even understand that. So I'm just putting that out there. Now it's yours, getting to your most important point.
Absolutely agree. We could go more into that later if you'd like. So yeah, so according to Mautner and many agree, right, the third institution, probably the most important move that the government does, but more importantly, I guess that the establishment does, is to gradually transfer governing power to the Supreme Court. This is, again, I'm sort of paraphrasing Mautner's theory, but he says this is a hegemony, right? Right? This is a ruling elite that understands that it's losing political power, understands that it's losing electorate power, and it tries to transfer governing power to unelected or bureaucratic institutions, which they believe that they will continue to dominate even though and long after the other, the non-elite or the other groups gain political power. So this is that backdrop is absolutely relevant. I think it took people a long time to understand that, meaning I think that wasn't clear in real time. And in retrospect, a lot of people sort of look back and say, oh, well, this was obviously sort of what was going on. And this ties into a different point, which we can go into. But the way in which the court expanded its power and made these changes to the Israeli governmental order were extremely gradual. They were extremely incremental. They were sophisticated, and they were strategic in the sense that, and this is part of what's greatly credited to Aharon Barak, and there are academic papers on this. Professor Rivka Weil, who's a well-known Israeli constitutional scholar, has a paper on the strategic court of Aharon Barak. And so Justice Barak sees decades ahead, right? He's playing 3D chess where everyone around him are kind of these little Lilliputians who just can't figure out, what's happening tomorrow, what's in front of their nose. And I'm not even, I explained in the book is not psychoanalysis, and I'm not going into what was inside people's minds and heads. I don't know what was in Barak's heart. But in retrospect, it's clear that Barak essentially had this long-term idea of where he wanted to get to. And it created change in the court, on and off the court, in a variety of different ways that was very systematic and methodical. And I can jump in if you'd like with a few examples.
I think it's useful for the audience because too often you don't pick up any papers these days, but you're looking at a newspaper and you're reading what's going on in Israel and you really have no idea. So maybe just one example of something that happened with Aharon Barak, so they can understand when they see that name in the news some of the previous association.
Right. Well, obviously, Barack is retired now since 2006, and I wish him, health and long life. He's an elderly man. He still is very involved in Israeli politics and in Israeli law,
Yeah,
and
his name still pops up.
his name pops up. Judges, are rumored to regularly consult with him, and he sort of, he voices his opinion regularly on issues in the Israeli public space. I think he's a little bit careful, probably more careful than some other retired judges. So from the early 80s, Barak and then other judges that slowly joined him and others in sort of legal academia and the establishment completely upended the Israeli legal order and then the governmental order. And he did this with a series of moves. And let me rattle them off for a moment, and then we can deep dive. One is statutory interpretation. How do you interpret laws? How do you apply laws? Two is threshold requirements. That means who can petition the court for redress, for remedy, right? What gives you the right to demand that the court intervene? And what is justiciable? What issues can be covered by the court's power or by the court's authority? And what Barak does is completely change the court's approach to this. Three is judicial supervision of executive action. And Barak completely changes the way that works. He invents a doctrine called extreme unreasonableness, which essentially says that judges can second guess and redecide any governmental decision of any kind, regardless of basis of
Where did he
law,
come
what
up
the
with
law
that?
says. You'll have to read the book. No, we'll get into that a little bit in a minute.
Give the listener two
So,
sentences. How does he
so
come up with
sure.
that?
So let's go by them one by one. So for statutory interpretation, this is essentially Barak's invention. Really is completely novel. I mean, that's true for everything, really. But I say Barak, and I should really say the court, and really at this point it's both. So let's go over those sort of
But
quickly, right?
where is everyone? How does it, when it first happens and he comes and says we can go over any decision of the government, and everyone's just nodding along at that point?
It's just an excellent question, and I think this is something which has not been sufficiently studied. Part of this is absolutely related to those sort of culture wars and what you were discussing earlier with the political right gaining ground, because what you have is all the typical, right? Who calls foul, right, when a court does something wrong, right? If we set politicians aside for a moment, right, because politicians could be very short-sighted. They care what the electorate cares about. That politicians can be sort of just mediocre and unskilled and unsophisticated. So typically, the media calls foul, or the legal establishment and legal academia, lawyers, etc., will call foul. And what happens in Israel, in many respects, is that these institutions and these different groups belong to the elite. And they like what they see. They want that to happen. So nobody is calling the court out for doing, or very few people are calling the court out for doing what it's doing, even though it's so clearly egregious. So let me give you an example, right? The court decides that from now on, and this was not, and of course the court completely appends its own jurisprudence, its own precedents on these issues. The court decides in the early 1990s, from now on, we will apply statutes according to their objective purpose. I'm using air quotes here. You can see them on the camera. Objective purpose. Objective means, according to the court, what the judge thinks, right? What is the morally correct purpose of this law? So if you can imagine, right, there's a law that's enacted by the Knesset, right? The Knesset has a clear purpose. The legal text has a clear content, right? Of exactly what it means.
The country, the democratically elected Knesset votes for the members of the Knesset who create a majority. Something is brought to the Knesset floor. It is approved as the representatives of the democratic people in Israel approve this. And then a couple people on the court say, well, it doesn't meet our moral standards, so we are going to object to it.
The court says, well, now that the law has been enacted, it has a life of its own. And now this is a legal question. This is not a political question. This is not a question of democratic authority. This is not a question of, government or political theory. This is a legal question. And as a legal question, we can interpret this law to serve a purpose or to produce an outcome, which we believe, right? They call it objective, as if this is a mathematical, right, formula. We believe, for example, that the correct purpose for this law is justice or human rights or something more specific. And therefore, we will interpret this law completely against the words of the law, the text of the law, the express purpose behind the law, etc. And
what's the most egregious example of a law that was objected to by these courts?
Unfortunately, There are so many. I mean, they are rampant and go throughout the state. And part of it is that how this method served so many other revolutions. But let me give you a very recent case, like a really recent case, which I actually don't even talk about in the book. So you have this kind of a bonus that you
Great.
don't get in the book. 2025, a case called Gortler. Israeli statutory law doesn't allow for same-sex couples to adopt a child. Okay. Now you can agree or disagree with this policy. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, and obviously, many countries do allow for same-sex couple adoptions of children. Over the years, with the court, and I'll get to the statutory language in a moment because it's important. Over the years, the court has expanded some of the exceptions. So this law has a bunch of exceptions to that rule. I'll say what the rule is in a moment. This law has a bunch of exceptions, and the court has gradually expanded those exceptions to allow more and more for same-sex adoption of children. But here's the law. The statutory text says that adoption in Israel is available only to a man and his wife. The words are ish ve'ishto. Ish ve'ishto is the statutory text, okay? And if you know any Hebrew, right, Hebrew is a gendered language, meaning all words, essentially most words, the vast majority of words have a male and female, right, component to them. Ish ve'ishto are unmistakable terms, which mean either a man and his wife or a husband and his wife. That's what these words means. They're clearly gendered. They clearly envision a married couple and a heterosexual, right, opposite sex couple. And over the years, it's been clear, obvious to everybody involved that this precludes adoption by same-sex couples. And again, you could be
Okay, one sec. Let's fast forward 1 second. This is
Yeah.
not even a conversation. Like, what are we talking about? Ish v'ishto, husband and wife. Okay, what are they saying?
Right. How is this even? But it's important to say to your viewers, you could dislike that. That's okay. And the way to
Yeah, this is not an endorsement of the policy or a rejection,
right,
whatever it is.
one way or another.
Put that to the side.
That's just the
That's
law.
not-
You can hate it, you can love it. It doesn't matter. That's what the law is unmistakable, right? It's unambiguous. In its recent ruling and this is in 2025, the Supreme Court comes along and says, actually, two things. The words ish ve'ishto aren't so unambiguous. They're actually very vague, and we don't. And I'm going to put that aside for a second because that's really loopy. Meaning that's an even greater stretch.
No, but we're in the realm of the patently stupid.
We're in Narnia. We're in Narnia, and
Yeah.
and it's talking to people. I wish maybe later I can actually bring up some quotes from the ruling, and or I'll have it another time. But more importantly, this is the important part because this is the methodology. The court comes along and says, even if the text is clear, we need to apply the law's purpose. Now, what is the law's purpose? So first of all, the judges come and say, actually, we don't know the purpose. It's unambiguous. We don't know why the legislature chose man and wife, maybe, etc. But then they say the objective purpose, and this is really important. The objective purpose, remember, does not even claim to be about what the lawmakers wanted or what the public wanted or what the words meant at the time. It's none of that. Objective purpose is an ideological, moral argument about what the law should want to do. Should. Okay, and the judges say this. Again, this is not a conspiracy.
Are these judges just bored?
This is how the judges describe this. So the judge says, and stay with me for this, bear with me. The judge is saying, this is what the court says in this case. The objective purpose of this law is welfare of the child. That is the objective purpose. And therefore, if it is welfare of the child, must interpret the words ish ve'ishto, husband and his wife, to include same-sex couples. And they say this is an interpretive exercise. All we're doing is applying the law. We are simply matching the application of the law to its moral and correct.
But they have no idea
purpose.
what it is. They have no idea what it is. Why is this even on their desk? Like, it's like why is it in their like? Why are they addressing this? Why couldn't, if it's something that someone wants a law to be changed, aren't there democratic ways to go through this? Like what?
Well, that's part of the beauty. So one of the arguments the court has been making, which is fantastic, it really demonstrates the court's view of how this works. The court says, we've given the Knesset so many opportunities to change this. We've given Parliament so many opportunities, and we've warned the Parliament that this is something which ought to be clarified or corrected. And what the court ignores is that that's exactly the point. The Knesset has been aware of this issue, and it has considered the issue. And this has been, a public controversy for a while. And the Knesset has consciously decided not to change the law. Now, maybe you can say, well, maybe the Knesset are terrible people. Maybe I'm against that policy. Maybe this is a terrible thing. But that's what the democratic process yielded. And this is a really important point because it ties into the broader view. And this is why, interpretation is such a big part of everything the court does. The question of interpretation ties directly to how the court views itself. And this is the biggest, most fundamental shift, or two, I should say, the two big shifts. And this is the overarching scheme of everything that the court did since the early 1980s, gradually but ever increasing ways. One is how the court views itself, right? And how it views itself vis-a-vis democracy, how it views itself compared to the democratic process and the electorate, etc. And the court stopped viewing itself as a neutral arbitrator and started viewing itself as an ideological arbiter, meaning it started seeing itself not as somebody that settles disputes according to law, but rather as an agent for morality, an agent for ideology, an agent for what it considered to be a just and virtuous agenda. And this is a totally different conception of what courts are for and what they can do. And the court embraces this wholeheartedly. And again, it says it. I mean, again, none of this is conspiratorial. None of this is about psychoanalysis or secret. They write it black on white. The court's role is to be an agent of virtue and justice and human rights and the rule of law, whatever it is, in society. But number two, and this is an important, right, the other side of that coin is not just about how the court views itself and its role. It's about its approach to the law. What the court does is increasingly and gradually, the court simply ignores the concept of the law as a discipline, as a profession, as something with any substance whatsoever. The court simply destroys the very idea that there is a law, that it comes from a certain authority, that it is binding, that it has a particular meaning, which is supposed to be implemented, etc. The court throws all of this out the window and these are in each one of the different aspects of what it does. And obviously the statutory interpretation and the last example that I just gave you is just one example of many.
So in America, you have different members of the Supreme Court who have different ways of viewing the Constitution and whether or not they're more progressive or conservative, but they're going back to the Constitution and trying to adhere to the principles of the Constitution and seeing if a certain law is within the American legal system, grounds it on the Constitution. What are Israeli Supreme Court justices looking back to and trying to ground their decisions within?
I love that question because I think it reflects a really important insight about Israel and the lack of our constitution and what judges in Israel do. Typically, when we think of, I'll answer your question, this is a quick preface. Typically, when we think of a constitution, right, we think about a constitution as limiting executive government. And then as limiting the legislature, right, an elected government, right, because the Constitution is a bunch of rules and laws and et cetera, and principles, et cetera, and we consider the Constitution to be a really important check on governmental power. But typically when we say governmental power, we mean the executive and the legislature, right? But what people recognize less often is that a constitution is also a check on judicial power, because judges, even when the judges are doing the most extreme or loony things, they have to try, even on the face of it, right, even for appearances, even as lip service, they have to try and justify what they're doing on the basis of a written text, on the basis of words. So there's a rational exercise here about what judges are trying to do, right? They're trying to ground what they're doing in a particular text. There's a famous scholar called Martin Laughlin, who wrote a book called Against Constitutionalism, and one of the most important components of any constitution that he describes is that it's subject to the discipline of a text. This is a quote from him: subject to the discipline of a text. And judges, and again, in modern constitutional systems, have to show why their decision-making is based on something within the Constitution. Even if it's substantive due process and something kind of crazy and not really a compelling argument, at least they have to pretend.
There's something that's grounding the situation. There's a grounding principle, which I can clearly discern in America. I have no idea what we're talking about in Israel.
Anchored in something. There is a direct link. There's a pipeline between popular authority and the way it crystallizes into the constitutional text or the constitutional substance, and then that into the judicial decision, right, etc. In Israel, and this is true even more so, we'll get into this soon, but this is true even more so ever since the court invented an Israeli constitution in 1995. We'll get to that in a moment. But even before that, the court's general approach has been to ignore, right, the very necessity to ground its decisions and laws in the legal text, and this is very important. But more important to your question, and I'll just finish with the sentence, part of Israel not having a constitution, part of the effect of that has been that the courts and judges have been running amok, right? They've been running wild with these different ideas partially because they never had that limiting factor of an actual constitution which could rein them in, an actual constitution which they even needed to pretend to be adhering to. So the lack of a constitution in many ways has been a liberating
It's
factor
carte
for the
blanche. They can
courts.
do whatever they want. But but what is it? Like, I still don't know. What are they
Correct.
claiming to be anchored in?
So look, there's a
It's
wonderful.
not the Torah.
There's a
What?
point in my book. I can find it if you want for a moment. You know what? Let's find it. There's a wonderful point where in one of his earliest rulings, right, Aharon Barak tries to describe what is the objective purpose of any, right, of any. Here, I got to find it.
While you find it, I'm
Yeah,
just going to
go
go
ahead.
on. The reason my hands are flying and I'm shaking my head and I'm freaking out here is this has quickly turned into one of the more important podcasts that I've ever
Oh, I appreciate
done.
that.
Well, let me keep going before you appreciate
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
But no, but to me, it's essential that Israel
Here, I found it.
divorce from the American Jewish community, divorce from America, from the perspective of being dependent, focus inward, stop relying on the interloping behavior of some of the diaspora communities, because the fact that some of these basic things are not taken care of, for good or bad, like we talked about the same-sex couple adoption, we're not talking about an opinion. We're just talking about how they come to the conclusion as being so insane. I'm very nervous for Israel, just from the perspective that there's so many things that have to be dealt with internally, and astroturfing what some random rabbi on the Upper East Side of Manhattan thinks of judicial reform is moronic. And the idea that the Jewish Federation of North America or the ADL or any of these places would have one iota of a thought to comment on anything in Israel is crazy. The fact that that Israel is then looking to them for assistance internally is crazy. And it's inviting all of these crazy things to happen because you're not actually formalizing or crystallizing certain core aspects of your country. And Israel, as a result, is just, instead of actually saying, hey, we're about to go off a cliff, let's take a couple steps back, they're just asking American organizations to secure rope and hold it for them as they try to go down and descend the mountain on the opposite side. That's how I'm seeing this crystallize
So
as we're
I
having this
really want to
discussion.
address that. Let me just
like,
give you this
yeah.
crazy quote, and then I do want to address that because it's so important. Here's one. This is from one of Aharon Barak's earliest rulings where he describes his idea of the methodology of objective purposive interpretation. And so he says, what are these potential objective purposes of any law? This is in any law, a judge can pull this out of a hat. And here he gives a list. He says equality, justice, morality, social objectives of the separation of powers, the rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of procession, of worship, of occupation, human dignity, judicial integrity, public peace and security. We're almost done. The democratic values of the state and its very existence. He keeps going. Good faith, natural justice, fairness, and reasonableness. And just to be clear, he clarifies that this is not an exhaustive list. Now, the reason I'm saying this...
Did Kamala Harris write this list?
There you go. He doesn't... But to your earlier question, no, Barak and others never make an attempt to ground this in actual, what we recognize as a legal source. It's from the ether. It is mysticism. It is shamanic, right? The idea is you have the power, right, to deduce. It's a sort of meditation, right? You have the power to deduce these things, which is inherent in your judicial role, or it's because of your legal education or something like that. But as a legal argument, it is simply non-existent. And this is true, and we've only touched on one aspect. I mean, this is just one chapter in the book. We've only touched on one aspect, which admittedly is the foundation, but one aspect of the court's crazy grab for power and expansion of power. But I really want to respond to what you just said about Jews in America and, their approach to this and Israel's approach to that. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because I think that this is, and many think in Israel, that this is one of the most important issues in Israel to be fixed. And this is, in 2023, when this whole issue blew up, right, a lot of American Jews were saying, or a lot of people outside Israel were saying, where did this come from? This came out of nowhere. Nobody's ever heard of this issue. But actually, people in Israel have been talking about this for 20 or 30 years. And people in Israel know that this has been an ongoing problem for at least 40 years, if not, and to greater and greater extent, if not even longer. So number one is, regardless of whether Israelis should or should not listen to, Jewish community leaders or Jews in the US or whatever, I want Jews in America and generally English speakers anywhere in the world to be able to educate themselves about this. I want them to get a clear look at this. I want them to be able to understand head to toe, top to bottom, in great detail, what this is actually about. Because unlike so many other issues, and like that we had spoken about this earlier, there's simply no resources. A person that wants to actually understand these issues in English, right, or in their native language, it's virtually impossible to understand. But I want to push back on one thing you said, which is that I think that the global community, and especially the global Jewish community, and especially the American Western Jewish community, do have something to contribute to this. It's not to coerce the state of Israel. It's not to foist their opinions on the Israeli electorate. It's not to lobby the government to withhold things from Israel so that Israel, right, does whatever they want ideologically or conforms to whatever they think in their superficial and shallow understanding of these issues, whatever they think is the solution. It's none of those. But I think even people on the left and on the right, people are progressives or conservatives, it doesn't matter. Anyone with a basic American civic education knows how messed up this is. And I need you to understand this, right? It doesn't matter if you're on the left, on the right. Any American reading this book and reading these rulings by the Israeli Supreme Court will say, holy crap. This is insane. No country can function like this. No court should be able to do that. Doesn't matter if they're reaching an outcome which I find desirable. So
right, yeah.
So just to finish that point is that I think that in conversation, in communicating a message, in talking Jew to Jew and fellow Jews in America talking to Jews in Israel, the one thing that they can contribute, and I want people on both sides of the aisle to do this, is to say, guys, this is a real problem, exactly kind of as you're saying. You need to fix this. The situation is not tenable. And more importantly, maybe just as importantly, not to buy in to the alarmist, right, hyperbolic hysteria, which says this is the end of democracy, right? Or this is Israel turning into a totalitarian dictatorship every time somebody tries to fix any one of these problems in like the most benign way. Jewish Americans need to be able to withstand that pressure and to say, you know what, guys, like, we understand this issue a little bit better now. We know that if you're changing the way judges are elected, or if you're limiting the reasonableness standard for review, we now understand that's not the end of democracy. That's a crazy argument, and we're not going to buy into that. We're not going to support your efforts to stop that or whatever it is.
I would say that the democracy ended, this thing started. The concept that it's the end of democracy, what democracy are you talking about, first of all? Second of all, I object to foreign intervention in Israel politically on all grounds. I think that the fact that these communities abroad are trying to do that is a problem, as you see when it's wrong if Clinton does it. I think it's wrong if Obama did it. It's wrong when Biden did it. It's wrong when Trump does it. I can call it right, left. I don't care. I just think also the reason why I'm a little bit conflicted about it is just that it's very hard for people to see through the alarmist coverage when you have, I believe it was Mati Friedman and a few other journalists, or Danny Gordis maybe, pleading with American communities to then stop this fascistic Netanyahu from all this. I mean, this is just malpractice. And then you have the way that it's covered in English media is worse than what we're even reading about in your book, because it's just completely detached from reality. And I think people have Bibi-itis, and this is not a defense of Bibi. But you have to just be able to divorce the issue from the person. And just the idea that this is how a place that calls itself a startup nation or calls itself a democracy would function in such a way is pretty concerning.
I couldn't agree more in the sense that, first of all, to the extent that anything is threatening Israeli democracy and Israel's right functioning and system of democracy, it has been, or the most significant threat to that has been for the past 40 years, the Israeli Supreme Court, without question. And I make this point in the book. And second of all, look, I mean, if there's one thing which is really important to take away from what you've been saying, and I'm sure this is a message you're making all the time, English speakers who are listening to English content about Israel and from Israelis are getting a sliver of the picture. And this has always been the case. And not just a sliver, right, in terms of the amount or the scope. It's that you have to consider that the vast majority of the outward-facing, English-speaking group, that sociological layer in Israel, belongs to a very specific ideological camp. And
left of center.
And it's left of center. I mean, left of center is the most moderate of them, right? And so you need to understand this. I mean, that doesn't mean that you should, right? That doesn't mean that everything they say is wrong or that you should write off everything. But
the problem is, though, is that they actually misrepresent where they stand. So a lot of people would read Times of Israel as a centrist thing. It's not centrist.
This is critical in the sense that, and here I'll sort of turn to your audience and say, the vast majority of content that you're getting in English from Israel, and especially if it represents itself as mainstream thought or mainstream views, etc., is that is absolutely certainly not the case. And this is, in Israel, I think it's especially bad. But even if it wasn't, just from a sociological perspective, that's what happens. You have a sort of more mobile right elite, which tends to lean more progressive. That happens in most countries where you have a sort of multinational, more cosmopolitan elite that knows how to speak to other countries. Right, the English speaking layer of society in Israel leans to the hard left, and that is the filter through which you're getting most of your content in English. And that's something that doesn't mean, again, you need to disband or you need to you need to despair of knowing anything about Israel, but you have to take that into account. You have to understand that you're getting a very narrow and slanted view of things both within Israel and of sort of a very limited reflection of how Israelis think and what they think about different things. And that's a more general point, but back to just the legal thing, this book demonstrates that very well. Like when you read this book, and I hope you do, when you read this book, you will constantly be saying to yourself, how the heck did I not know this? How the heck is this not talked about more by the people that I rely on? How is this not constantly reflected to me by Israeli English-speaking media? How is this possible that I've been lied to, that I've been duped? Like when people say changing X is the end of democracy, and actually X was the biggest problem for Israeli democracy. How is this possible? So I hope that this is a place in which the book also ties into that theme.
Now, you're inviting me to ask a different question about democracy in general, and I have refrained from. I actually don't typically refer to Israel as democracy for a different reason, which I would love to. We'll talk to hopefully after. But just to bring, now that we've covered some of the ground of how I would argue messed up and backwards the judicial system in Israel was created, to bring it fast forward, and I don't want to spoil all your book, but to fast forward to 2023 when everything really went haywire. And the moron of Gallant and Herzl Levy, these fools, said all these things that were under attack and then didn't do anything. They said, we're going to be under attack if we use judicial reform. But then they actually didn't do anything. So I think they should be tried for that. That's just my personal thing. What happened in 2023?
Absolutely. This requires one very brief description of a critical chapter, which we left out. And I mean, there's so much we left out. I have to assure our viewers that there's so much here in between that we haven't even touched upon. But I'll just say that among all the other things that happened, in 1995, the court came along and said, hey, there are a bunch of laws which are not a constitution. They're not remotely recognizable as a constitution. They were not enacted as a constitution, but we're going to start treating these laws as a constitution. And they're called basic laws. And from now on, the court decided these basic laws serve as Israel's constitution. And we, the court, will start striking down legislation, striking down laws of the Knesset enacted by Knesset majority. We will start striking them down as unconstitutional, even though we don't have anything recognizable as a constitution, even though the Israeli public never voted for a constitution or enacted a constitution or anything like it. So this is like a third of the book, okay, which I've just glossed over. This is a really, really important.
But let me just interject, which is, on my podcast, I talk about some tough truths. That's pretty much what I do on this podcast. There's something that I want to just insert parenthetically here. I don't even really need you to follow too much, but I think it's important for the listener. I'm very upset about a lot of the propaganda that comes out of what people would say Hasbara and everything like this. And there was a conscious decision, Israel, to America. So as I mentioned to people on this podcast when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, one of the first times I ever interacted with Charlie Kirk, who became a very dear friend of mine for about 2 years when I was in college and he had dropped out, he was under constant attack from left-leaning groups on college campuses when he was trying to get right-wing students to combat the boycott, divestment, sanction movement. They would say, you're hurting the cause because we need to bring the Gay Straight Alliance. We need to bring the Transgender Club. We need to bring all of these left-leaning groups to defend Israel's image because essentially we need to pinkwash Israel and make it seem as if it's San Francisco, and then people will hate Israel a little less, as you saw after October.
Which never works.
Right, and never works. And was correct. Yeah. Horrible strategy. But part of that is that Israel and American Jewish organizations have spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, pumping garbage into the minds of diaspora Jews in English, thinking that they're going to change the mind of hard left when in truth, you're actually misleading people about some of the foundational issues that Israel faces, not faulting any of the founders, not looking to say, oh, maybe Ben Gurion's a bad person, or maybe no, it's not about that. It's just you have to be able to address the issue at its face, because some of the issue with your book, at least how people will be at least open to it, is that there's been so much garbage that was pumped through APAC and pumped through JFNA and pumped through the ADL and all these things of, you can't hate us. We're the only democracy in the Middle East. You can't hate us. We have a gay pride parade in Tel Aviv. You can't hate us because we're so open and pluralistic and all these things. And I'm not even talking about whether or not it's 80% true, 90% true, or whether it was a good strategy. But when you have programmed people to say the reason that that America stands, and that is the go-to defense, to then look at your book and look at the actual foundational issues and say there are things that Israel as a nascent country has to address that infringes on its ability to be a true democracy. Well, so what are you talking about? I just read in Startup Nation that this is a democracy. So it's a little bit of a problem of its own making in a much more profound way than I even realized when we started recording this today.
Well, I won't push back too much because I'll let you leave that there, and I'll continue with the legal stuff. The one thing which I'll sort of push back a tiny bit is just that I think it's fair to gloss over some things in the sense that, yes, despite all of this, Israel is a flawed democracy, but I agree that there's a great many problems in sort of making that your argument for everything that justifies Israel, that justifies aligning with Israel. But also, and I agree that there's a big problem of just constantly glossing over these profound problems. And I think the book will be very unsettling for people who have been constantly, right? If for certain people, the greatest thing to say about Israel is that it's such a vibrant democracy, this book will be unsettling, but it will be unsettling from the exact opposite direction that they expect to hear, right? They expect to hear that Israel is becoming a not democracy because of the right-wing politicians or whatever.
Right.
Israel's democracy has been unraveling for 40 years to a very great extent thanks to the Israeli Supreme Court.
But let me I just want to say one thing here. And I spoke to Jonathan Conricus about how the IDF spokesperson's unit handles its international relations and also its domestic relations, and how that line has really been
it's a joke, but yeah.
Well, yeah, but that line has been eviscerated a little bit, because where it used to be 50 years ago, if you spoke in Hebrew, nobody had ChatGPT. There's no translators. You don't know what's going on right away. And now when you speak in Hebrew, you're assuming that Iran is looking at it. You're assuming that these people are actually able to speak that same language. And I think that, I guess, the heart of my issue with what's been going on in English abroad is that if the message is exclusively because you're trying to fight against Arab propaganda, then you're also it's important to also have part of the discussion, if you care about what the American Jewish community or diaspora Jewish community is saying. I think it's important to also have some of that messaging, even privately, about just some of the bigger issues, and not just have everyone blind to some of the problems that you're saying, glossing over. And I think that sometimes people just said, well, we need to arm our students with facts. Here's 8 facts about Israel. And then you're not actually talking about it, and it leads to some of these bigger picture issues, which are now being weaponized against Israel. So when you have Knesset members trying to make a change to ensure Israel's democracy, the institutions in America are actually working against them. So anyway.
I agree that, first of all, we should put that in parentheticals. I'd love to talk also more about Hasbara and we could for another time.
I'll have you back on another episode to do that, because this is...
But I should say that I couldn't agree more that at the end of the day, these things need a deep dive, and I don't think we're served by a shallow and superficial understanding of these issues as bullet points, and that's why I wrote a big book about it, to address one aspect of that.
Your book is very big. It's very well read, well researched, and it's like you can't read it while you're a little bit tired. You have to be awake, have a cup of coffee, and pay attention, because it's a lot of pieces. Yeah.
It's a serious treatment of the issues, and it requires, the proper attention. So back to 2023, I'll say this very briefly. And really, and the book isn't about the 2023 reforms. It kind of goes along a little bit with them, and we come back to them occasionally. But
by the way, I'll just say this: it's similar to October 7th. I got to say, 2023 was a pivotal year for Israel in a number of things. Cracks finally just exploded, but the idea that the judicial reform of 2023 is the heart of the issue is BS. Just like October 7th being the heart of the issue with the army, BS. So it's a different
Right,
reframe,
right,
which
right.
is what your book is
I
doing. Yeah, yeah,
appreciate the analogy or the similarity in the sense that, in the same way that October 7th wasn't, it's not that the army failed specifically on October 7th and October 6th, everything was fantastic. It's that
correct.
October 7th represents an ongoing conceptual failure militarily, strategically, geopolitically, right? Everything, like across the board. So the judicial reform crisis and some of those issues absolutely reflect an ongoing crisis. And I say this, when we talk about judicial reform in 2023, especially back then during the controversy, I had a recurring theme that I would say is Israel has been in a constitutional crisis, but not since 2023, since at least 1995, and if not since like 1981. Meaning, yes, Israel has been on a rolling constitutional crisis, but this did not start yesterday. And then, in the same vein, people talked about judicial reform. We've had judicial reform. It's just been driven and enacted unilaterally by the Supreme Court. Meaning the judicial reform that the Supreme Court has executed, has brought about since the mid-1980s is far more extreme in scope and extent than anything that the government has proposed and anything that the government has thought of doing. And it doesn't have the sanction of democratic elections. It doesn't have the authority of democratic will. And that's the real judicial reform. That's the real legal reform that we've been having for the past 40 years. The 2023, right? Some government agenda tried to do is just a small response, a small measure against that. If you'd like to, we can go a little bit into the 2023 reforms. I'm happy to. You tell me.
Yeah, I think just for the benefit of the audience, what's a non-hysterical reading of what was done in 2023?
First of all, it's even the idea of what's done and what wasn't done is an important point. So sort of, at the end, only sort of one legislative measure was successfully enacted in July of 23, and then another one in mid 24. So it's like, what was done versus what was announced and what was planned are two different things. But here's what the government intended to do, right? In broad strokes. And this divides into sort of four categories. The government tried to limit the unreasonableness standard for review. The unreasonable standard review is a standard which the court invented in the mid-'80s and then the mid-'90s that they can second-guess any government decision regardless of statutory text or legal authority or et cetera. So that's one. Two is to change the way judges are selected in Israel, especially Supreme Court judges, and to reduce the involvement of judges and especially the involvement of the Supreme Court in the way that its own members are chosen. And again, this is a whole other issue. We could spend a whole podcast talking only about the way Supreme Court justices are selected in Israel. But the short version is the Supreme Court justices in Israel have a veto power over who joins the bench, who their colleagues are, and who replaces them. They can essentially dictate who joins the Supreme Court.
What percent of Israelis recognize that that's nuts?
I want to come back to that. That's a really important question. Okay, I promise to come back to that question.
Yeah,
Super important question. And again, there's a reason that the first chapter in my book is about judicial selections. And this is obviously one of the most important elements and components of judicial supremacy in Israel. So they wanted to alter that. Number three has to do with the legal counsel to the government. I'm not even going to get into that, but the legal counsel to the government is this very high-ranking bureaucrat who's essentially sort of a proxy of the court inside the executive government. Not even getting into that. That's a whole other conversation. And then finally, regarding judicial review of legislation, the Knesset was going to enact all kinds of changes to how and whether and when the Supreme Court could strike down laws. And I'm not even, again, going to get into that. Or we could, but that's a whole conversation. But the point I want you to recognize, this is much more important. First of all, these were just ideas and they were immediately sort of written off and burned to the ground, right? Even the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Esther Chayut, called these as an attack on democracy, an attack on the rule of law before there was even ever any draft bills, right? These were just sort of announced by the Minister of Justice, something that he wanted to do. The Supreme Court of Justice the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court publicly announced her position that these are undemocratic, vicious attacks on the rule of law, vicious attacks on Israeli democratic order, etc. So just that kind of exemplifies that the very idea in Israel for many people and for the legal elite, the very idea of the Knesset and of the elected representatives having any say in fundamental arrangements of government, having any say to backtrack anything that the court has done, is fundamentally illegitimate, is fundamentally invalid, etc. But here, the big points I want to make about the reforms, and I'll try and do it quickly, is three. One is that at the very most, the reforms would have slightly rolled back some of the things the court did. And what I mean by that is that in 1980, there was no reasonableness review, as we know it. In 1990, there was no judicial review of legislation. And these are just examples. And in that sense, if you think that Israel was a democracy, at least to some extent, or in a conventional sense, right? If you claim that Israel was a democracy in 1990, then all these reforms are kosher. All these reforms are fine. In the sense that in order to believe that these reforms make Israel not a democracy, then you have to claim that Israel was not a democracy in 1990, when all these things didn't exist and were not caused by the court. Number two is that these reforms would have brought Israel closer to other countries in every respect, meaning, and there's a great quote from Alan Dershowitz who says this. Professor Alan Dershowitz, who I'm sure you might be familiar with, one of the most important sort of constitutional scholars and criminal law specialists in America. He was at Harvard, etc. Alan Dershowitz is a big supporter of the Israeli Supreme Court. He's a personal friend of Justice Aharon Barak, and he was against the legal reforms. And yet, Alan Dershowitz explained to anybody that would listen that these reforms would not make Israel a dictatorship, would not make it any less of a democracy, and if anything, they would have made Israel more similar to Canada, Australia, England, New Zealand, and other valid democratic countries.
Why was he against the reform?
He thought they weren't a good idea. He thought that it was okay that the Supreme Court had that power. Meaning, I think he was wrong on that, and I think he wasn't disciplined enough in his sort of treatment of the issue. But without even getting into the weeds, to put it differently, that's almost asking the wrong question. And this is really maybe the most important point about the reforms. And I really want this to stay with the audience, and this should also stay with you with the future conversations about legal reform in Israel. There are two separate conversations that people pretend are the same conversation. One conversation is these reforms or other reforms a good or bad idea. Are these a good or bad idea? Do we support these or are we against them? What are the pros and cons, right? What are the benefits and detriments of these, and what are the upside and downside of these different reforms, right? What are the arguments for and against them? But there's a different argument which says these reforms are profoundly, fundamentally illegitimate and undemocratic, and they are born in sin, and every part of them, every measure of them, like there's no conceivable argument in their favor. That argument has to be categorically rejected. That is absolute farce, meaning you can have legitimate concerns about these reforms, about the 2023 reforms, about others, right? You could have legitimate concerns about, right, legislative efforts to curb the court's power, and we can have a conversation about that. But that's not what the protest movement was doing. And that's not what the protest movement was saying. The protest movement was saying, this is the end of Israeli democracy. This is an undermining of the rule of law in Israel. And that was patently preposterous. That was patently false and disgraceful, ridiculous, outrageous claim. And this is why this brings us back to Alan Dershowitz. That's what Alan Dershowitz was addressing. He was saying, I'm against, right? He's against the reforms, and we can have a conversation about whether they're a good or a bad idea. But even he, Alan Dershowitz, friend of the court and opposed to the reforms, even he could not tolerate this BS, this outrageous idea that the reforms were anti-democratic, or that if they were enacted, they somehow placed Israel beyond the pale of like conventional or legitimate democratic policy. And I want you to keep in mind, I want you, the listeners, to keep that in mind always. I'm sure you'll read the book, but even if you don't read the book, when you're hearing about legal controversies in Israel, you need to be able to divide between a rational, reasonable, or reasoned argument, fact-based argument about what is this actually about, what is actually happening, what are the details, what are the arguments for and against, why do reasonable people disagree on this, right? Why do intelligent, thoughtful, well-meaning, patriotic people disagree on this issue? And you have to reject the notion, and you have to reject the argument, or you have to listen out for that argument when people are just screaming at the top of their lungs, end of democracy, and this is the apocalypse of Israel, etc. And I think that's what Alan Dershowitz was pushing up against.
Is there a space in Israel for this conversation to actually happen at this point? Because, if you watch what the right would call the poison networks, you have Channel 11, Channel 12, Channel 13 that they're saying are all liars. The left sees Channel 14, it's fake news. And, is there any forum to have a constructive conversation about these issues within Israel?
So I'll give you there are a few great answers I can give you. One is yes, and two is maybe. But the yes, I'll start with the yes. I'll give a great plug and a shout out to the Israel Law and Liberty Forum. The Israel Law and Liberty Forum is organization in Israel, which I helped found and I had run for a while. It's loosely based or roughly based on the model of the Federalist Society in the United States. But what it does is it encourages and engenders and facilitates serious, sophisticated, respectful discourse. Right, it enables serious, in-depth conversation between top legal figures and just between regular people in the legal community about these core issues. And I think that's one of the most important elements of the solution is giving people the ability to even just talk about these things in a serious professional way without, just screaming at each other or without just hurling slogans at each other. More to the point, I think there's a broader thing involved, which is this. The answer is yes and no, or no and yes, which is that the Israeli public has become increasingly more and more aware of these issues. And there have been more and more forums and more people who are aware and capable of talking about these issues, right? So today you have Channel 14 and you have Israel Hayom and Israel Today, and you have other mainstream media outlets where regardless of whether, whatever criticism we might have of them, they are much more willing and able to float these issues, to raise them. I'm not going to say that it's an intelligent treatment of these issues, right? I'm not going to say that it's an in-depth treatment, but even just presenting the other side in gross terms, you have that more. More importantly, of course, thanks to social media and other avenues, you just have much more public awareness of these issues and a much more ongoing public debate. However, the other side of that, or the reaction to that, is that you also have a much more toxic and acerbic public debate about these issues. And in the sense that you have the sort of the hegemony, right, or the ruling elite, or the people that benefit from the court's power, they have become much more ruthless. They have become much more aggressive in their efforts to shut down debate, in their efforts to sort of slander or besmirch anyone that thinks differently. So it's kind of this weird situation in which, on the one hand, you have an expansion of this conversation because you have much more people who are aware of it. You have many more sophisticated actors who are capable of speaking about these issues in a serious way. But at the same time, you have a much stronger response from the other side and from the powers that be. And this includes very, very influential and powerful and aggressive institutions, both inside the state apparatus and outside the state apparatus, who are very, very capable of trampling people's lives and destroying all kinds of people's careers and personal lives and livelihoods, etc. So you have this counter response, this counter reaction of a much more aggressive effort to silence that very conversation and to stop that very conversation and to hold it back. But the one point of optimism in that sense that I'll say is, a friend of mine pointed this out recently, is on the one hand, you have, we won't get into this, but the whole issue with the military attorney general, the Patar.
Yes. That's for the next
that's
podcast,
for the next
yeah.
episode. And there's really just a massive, gross violation of the law, a morally reprehensible act that allegedly seems to have happened, and it seems very clear that it has happened. But at the same time, you have this massive cover-up attempt, which many parts of the legal establishment and the judiciary as well are sort of complicit in trying this to both facilitate this cover-up earlier and to collaborate in the cover-up now, and are complicit in the cover-up. So on the one hand, that's very disheartening, because you can see this sort of cover up in front of our very eyes, and you're like, they're still able to do this even though we're all watching. They just do it unabashedly, even though the situation is so clearly bad. But on the other hand, there's something encouraging about it, because 10, 15, 20 years ago, this kind of thing would have slipped completely under the radar. There would have been no conversation about it, not in the public, not by the legal figures. There would have been no uproar, right? This would have just, meaning the power of the legal establishment and the legal minds would have been able to just move this kind of thing along without anyone noticing. On the one hand, we're having a very aggressive public conversation. On the other hand, the fact that we're having this conversation, that it's now a major issue of public controversy, that is in itself encouraging, and I think a step in the right direction.
So I agree that it's good to have the conversation. I'm fearful because you have officials like Yoav Gallant, Herzl Levy, and some commentators as well who said, oh, well, this is a threat to our democracy. We're so divided because some lunatics started protesting, and then they're almost trying to pin October 7th on the disunity. So they're actually trying to use October 7th as a shield against any sort of movement on this issue. Because if you bring up, okay, this is important, perhaps Israel as a country should examine these proposals again, and they'll say, well, do you want another October 7th? It's a very cynical use of what happened. I guess I'm a little bit more skeptical that Israel will be able to really engage in these issues anytime in the immediate future, just because it's very raw and people have wrongly used it as a wedge issue, right? Like I mentioned before, Yoav Gallant gets up, I believe it was May 25th, 2023, and says Israel is under increased threat as a result. Now, with hindsight, 2.5 years later, you say, okay, Mr. Gallant, well, what did you do? The answer is nothing. So that's like more of the problem than him identifying the problem being that there was division because of the judicial reform. The natural response would say, if you identify that there's a response, what concrete steps did you immediately give as the role of the Minister of Defense? But I don't really see the conversation in an intellectual sense being able to be had that way because it's just so raw and people are trying to pin it on a political actor. They're trying to say basically, we hate Bezalel Smotrich, we hate Itamar Ben-Gvir, we hate some people that live in Yudav Shamron, so therefore this is a bunch of messianic lunatics, and therefore we can't talk about it. That's my concern.
So I do want to address that. I think, obviously, first of all, I should say there's two different points here. One is about sort of the military or operational conversation to be had, and I think you're right that there's also a very big problem in Israel's ability to have that conversation because it's so raw, because people view things so differently. In one of our next conversations, I think you make an excellent point, which people don't make enough at all, which is, right, if the heads of the military and the heads of intelligence and the heads of the defense ministry, et cetera, were certain that the current situation was creating a risk, then what operational strategic precautions were you taking to address that? And the answer is it seems very, very little. And that's obviously an enormous dereliction of duty. And I think that's not
according to the IDF's own investigation.
Right. And I think that's that's an incredible point, which is just not addressed at all in public discourse. And I agree. I think we should be pushing that. But setting that aside for a moment and tying this back to the legal conversation, because I think the point that you're making, which is absolutely true, is that returning to these controversies, right, or these legal questions have now been overshadowed by October 7th. In the sense that any future attempt to do something similar now evokes the memory of October 7th. And you have these different sides saying, oh, well, October, this strife or this discord or these disagreements or these proposals, right? These efforts at change contributed to October 7th and are in some ways, right, they have some culpability for October 7th, which I think is an obscene and outrageous argument.
Hashem wants us to be unified as Am Yisrael.
Right.
So it doesn't matter if people.
That's not even right.
But I'm saying it gets to a level.
The naivety of unity. But I do want to address that.
It's so cynically used because people want to feel better. They want to feel good.
So I want to address that in a few ways. But the first thing that I'll say is that, yes, you're right. But for better and for worse, and maybe this is for worse, that argument in Israel, meaning you won't necessarily know this if you're, and I'm sure you know this, but I'm saying to other people won't necessarily know this if they're only listening to English language media, right? But in Israel, even that argument cuts both ways. And on the right, you have at least this equal argument, this counterpoint, which says October 7th is at least partially, I'm not talking about the conspiracy theories, which also exist. Correct. But there are people that are saying in public, and I think reasonably so, right? October 7th is in part, some of the factors that contributed to October 7th was the judicial intervention with military affairs and the legal intervention with national security and defense policy, and how judicial supremacy in Israel directly contributed to October 7th. And more specifically, right, they say the protest movement and its outrageous response to these reforms and the lies they were telling about Israeli democracy. And of course, and the way that they weakened and undermined the Israeli military and Israeli defense capabilities, that's what contributed to October 7th, not the measures themselves, but the completely insane response to them by this protest movement, and they bear responsibility. Now, I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just saying, so you have this connection or this approach which ties between October 7th and the judicial and the protest movement comes from both directions. But in a way, I believe, and I've thought about this quite a lot, this is a reason that I believe that my book and that discussing these issues and understanding them in depth is so indispensable. And I'll tell you why. In the end, if you're going to win that argument, or if you're going to persuade a person one way or another, it is inevitable that you will have to go back to the substance of the argument itself. You're going to have to go back to the merits. So what I mean by that is, if you want to blame October 7th on the judicial reform or on the protest movement, that's going to boil down to an argument about whether the judicial reform was justified or not. Period. If you think judicial reform was justified, then the protesters are at fault for making such a hullabaloo about all this. And if you think the judicial reform were a crazy authoritarian power grab, then of course that better supports the idea that they are culpable for at least partly for October 7th. And in turn, in order to understand what you think about judicial reform in 2023 or in the future, you need to understand the problems. You need to understand what has happened in the Israeli legal system over the past 40 years. You need to understand how bad it is. You need to understand what the actual arguments are against the Israeli legal system, against the Israeli judiciary. From there stems everything. Meaning, if you understand this issue, your position on this will dictate, and you might come out, it will dictate your approach towards judicial reform, towards the protest movement, and towards the relationship between any of those and October 7th. Now, it is important for me to say October 7th is because of Hamas and the Palestinians and, the Palestinian Arab Islamist death cult against the Jews in Israel. And I'm not saying that it's inevitable. And obviously there's so much more that we could have done. And there's massive culpability on the side of Israel as well in terms of, right, how they contributed to it. But it's always important for me to say, right, responsibility for October 7th is with the vicious, wicked, barbaric animals who are Hamas and their helpers and their supporters. But just to sort of summarize that last point, I think
But
that
they didn't swear an
issues
oath
is
to the
so
state of
important.
Israel.
But what's that?
They didn't swear an oath to the state of Israel.
Correct.
I mean,
Correct.
obviously, it's
Correct.
just.
Correct.
But again, I know you have to say that. I'm just going to say.
Yeah. No,
okay,
of course. Of course. I know.
If you're
But
if you're getting a pension, you have drivers, you're running
right.
around like
Yeah,
you're
I
hot
agree.
stuff.
I agree. We're within that
Yeah.
other conversation about
Sure.
culpability of those who should have known better, who are serving
Who
the
are
state of
getting
Israel,
paid to do
who are serving the
something
state
to
of Israel.
stop it. Okay. Yeah.
But to reiterate that one last point one last time, everything stems from your understanding of the issues, and you have to understand these issues. And unlike some other issues, they are profoundly complicated. There's a very detailed history. There are really good arguments about why the situation in Israel is so bad and needs to be fixed. It cannot stay at the level. If you're going to consider yourself an informed individual and having an informed opinion on this, it cannot stay on the level of just slogans and headlines and this very superficial understanding from a bunch of so-called experts. You have to do a deep dive. And when you do a deep dive, that understanding of the merits of the issues, of how bad the situation is in Israel, how profound these problems are, that will lead you to a better conclusion about who's responsible for what is historically right or wrong, who is justified, et cetera, and of course for the future. And the one last thing I'll say about this is these problems are too profound and too fundamental to be swept aside. They cannot be kicked down the road. They will continue emerging and undermining and destabilizing the Israeli political order and Israeli society until they're fixed. And it's not going anywhere. It doesn't matter if there's no political will. Doesn't matter if it doesn't matter who's winning elections. It doesn't even matter what security challenges and risks and dangers Israel has. These issues go to the core of Israeli society and government, and they will continue to plague us until they're resolved.
Yonatan Green, thank you so much for joining. His book, Rogue Justice. I highly recommend everyone pick it up so that they can have a better sense of what's going on in Israel, be better informed, more involved in the conversation. And Yonatan, I'd love to have you on again to talk about those other issues, but I really appreciate you taking the time now.
Thank you so much, Danielle.